Princess Catherine just did something the palace almost never allows. And the reason she chose to do it turns out to be far more emotional than anyone outside those walls could have anticipated. This was not a formal press bulletin or a carefully assembled release that had passed through the hands of a dozen communications officials. She sat down by herself, looked at the statement her advisors had written for her, and quietly set it aside. Then she spoke in her own voice about Prince Louis and the private road to recovery that the family had been guarding closely for months. And here is where it becomes genuinely significant. The palace had stayed so completely silent for so long that people had started asking questions. Engagements were being rearranged without explanation. Schedules kept shifting. The youngest prince was simply not appearing anywhere, and no one was saying why. That silence was a deliberate choice. William had pushed for it from the very beginning, because he believed that keeping Louise out of public view would protect him from speculation, from headlines, and from the particular kind of permanent scrutiny that tends to attach itself to royal children from the moment they are old enough to wave at a passing crowd. Catherine understood that instinct entirely, but at some point along the way, she began to see that the silence was producing a problem of its own. Louis had started to believe that his condition was being kept quiet because the family was ashamed of it. That is the detail that changes everything. So let us look at what actually happened here, because the timeline tells a real story when you lay it out carefully. Prince Louis had been recovering from complications following a serious respiratory illness. At the beginning, the family assumed it was an ordinary seasonal infection, the kind children pick up regularly and shake off within a week. But it became clear fairly quickly that this was something different. The fatigue was not lifting. He was leaving his breakfast untouched, not speaking much about it. He pointed to his chest and told William he felt too tired to eat. The real turning point, the moment Catherine would later describe as the one from which everything changed, came during a private rehearsal at Windsor. This was intended to be a gentle reintroduction for Louise, a practice run before any formal royal appearance, a space where the family could prepare without the presence of crowds or cameras or any external pressure. Midway through the morning, Louis stopped. He reached for his mother's hand and whispered that he could not catch his breath. Catherine knelt beside him immediately and wrapped both of her hands around his. She felt how cold his fingers had become, even though the room itself was warm. William cleared the space of everyone except the medical team. He personally made sure George and Charlotte were taken to a different part of the residence, because he was not willing to let either of his older children watch their brother struggling like that. That morning changed something inside that household that could not easily be changed back. Here is where the contradiction between the family's public face and what was actually happening at home begins to emerge. William called for every engagement involving Louis to be suspended without delay. He was clear that missing a ceremony mattered far less than allowing his son's condition to deteriorate. That is a difficult position to argue against. But senior aides raised a concern. In royal life, an engagement is an official duty carried out on behalf of the monarchy, and when a prince simply stops appearing at them, people notice. The advisors wanted a controlled explanation in place before speculation had a chance to fill the empty space. William said no. He would not allow his son's recovery to become a public narrative while the boy was still frightened and uncertain about his own body. The desire to protect him was total, but the silence did not only protect Louis, it began to affect the other children in ways the parents had not fully anticipated. George, as the eldest, had concluded that being calm was what was expected of him. He was trying to become a source of steadiness for everyone around him. But one evening he asked William whether a younger brother could be seriously unwell without anyone outside the family being told. That question was not really about palace communication strategy. He was asking whether silence was a signal that something was worse than he was being told. Charlotte, meanwhile, was reading every closed door and every conversation that dropped to a lower volume. she understood considerably more than anyone had explained to her. She started leaving handwritten jokes beside Louis's bed because she had worked out for herself that making him laugh, even briefly, brought back more of the brother she recognized. And when she overheard staff talking about the attention that would follow the announcement, she found Catherine and asked whether strangers were now worrying about her brother. Then she asked whether Louis was going to have to speak to all of them. These are not questions that children should have to carry on their own. Catherine was carrying a weight of her own that was different in character. She was reassuring Charlotte that recovery sometimes moves at its own pace, while managing how little she had slept herself. She was holding back her own darkest fears, because she wanted to protect William, and he was doing exactly the same thing to protect her. Their commitment to each other held steady, but exhaustion was turning ordinary kindness into something more guarded and more careful. At the center of all of this was Louis, too young to understand the conventions of royal protocol, but old enough to recognize fear in the faces of the adults around him. He had always been the child who broke into quiet rooms with sudden questions, with laughter, with unpredictable bursts of energy. Being the youngest prince meant he carried fewer of the immediate royal expectations that shaped life for George and Charlotte, but he was absolutely central to the family's sense of what normal life felt like. That is why his sudden exhaustion landed so heavily. The disagreement between Catherine and William finally came to a point after she wrote her own statement by hand. She placed those pages in front of him after the children had gone to bed. The official palace draft sat beside them. A palace-approved statement is one that has been reviewed and cleared by royal advisors before any public release, designed to protect privacy and prevent confusion. But to Catherine, those sentences felt like they were describing someone else's experience. They acknowledged recovery without touching fear. They referenced progress without any trace of what the family had actually been through. William read the first line and shook his head. He reminded her that a public message, once released, could be replayed and analyzed and referenced for years after Louis had fully recovered and moved well beyond any of this. He asked whether she had thought about what it would mean to see their son's illness discussed in detail by people who had never been in the same room as him. His voice rose and then stopped. Both of them understood that the anger was coming from somewhere that was not really about the statement. Catherine did not step back. She told him that Louis had started to believe the silence existed because the family was ashamed of what had happened to him. Then she pushed the official draft to one side and said that its polished language contained nothing of the actual boy, the child they had nearly watched lose faith in himself. She pointed out that George and Charlotte had learned to lower their voices the moment Louis's health came up in conversation, that their eldest son had started watching every closed door, that their daughter was leaving jokes beside her brother's bed because she had understood, without being told, that laughter was part of how he was getting better. The silence was no longer protecting one child. It had started shaping all three of them. And then she told William something that appears to have broken through his defenses in a way that nothing else had managed. Louis had made a request of his own. He wanted to thank the medical team that had made him feel safe during the worst of it. He wanted George and Charlotte to understand that the things they had done for him had mattered. And more than anything, he did not want people to think he had disappeared, because he was not brave enough to be seen. William sat down. He covered his face for a moment, and then he admitted that his decisions had been driven not only by a desire for privacy, but by his own terror of losing control over what happened next. For a man who has been raised his entire life to hold his composure in public, that is a significant thing to say out loud. Together, they found an agreement. Catherine could speak, but she would protect the medical specifics, while being honest about the seriousness of what the family had been through. There was still one authority who could stop the message from going out, and that was King Charles. Charles received the draft during an evening briefing, dismissed the room before reading it, and went through the pages twice. When he reached the line about a child mistaking privacy for shame, He took his glasses off and set them on the table. The words unsettled him. Royal duty has long prioritized restraint, often before children are old enough to understand what restraint costs them. Louis had been shielded from public scrutiny, but that same protection had begun to make him feel as though he was being hidden. When William arrived shortly afterward, Charles asked only one question. Did the statement genuinely serve Louis, or was it primarily there to ease the anxiety that the adults around him were carrying? William defended Catherine's instinct, but acknowledged that once the recording was out, the family would lose some control over where the story went. Reporters would examine prior absences. They would question decisions that had been made with the best intentions. Officials had prepared a safer version of the statement, but it had removed Louis's own wish to thank the people who had supported him. Charles rejected that version. A statement stripped of the child's actual meaning, he concluded, would protect the institution while failing the person at its center. He gave his approval on one condition. Louis had to hear every word of the statement before it was released and understand clearly what the public would learn from it. Catherine read the final version to her son privately. Louis listened with a concentration that surprised her. Then he corrected one line. He did not want her to say he was merely doing better. He wanted people to know he was getting strong again. She changed it without hesitation. Charles approved the revised wording and included a handwritten note with his response. Truth delivered with restraint, he wrote, could protect the crown more honestly than silence. The recording went out. Catherine spoke quietly, thanked those who had protected Louis, and confirmed that his strength was returning. The response arrived quickly, and it was larger than most people inside the palace had prepared for. Phones started ringing, headlines went up, messages came in through every available channel, but the character of the coverage shifted faster than expected. Broadcasters began reconstructing timelines from Louis's recent absences, placing older family appearances next to Catherine's new statement and looking for patterns. One commentator paused footage taken before the illness and began analyzing the boy's expression in detail. William reached for the remote and switched the television off. His son's recovery, he said quietly, was not going to become entertainment. But something else was already happening outside the palace. Something that speaks more directly to what the announcement actually meant to people who heard it. Families began arriving at Windsor Castle and leaving handwritten blue stars against the public barrier. Each one carried Louis's own words. Getting strong again. The stars multiplied throughout the day. Some bore messages written directly to Louis. Others carried the names of different children who were facing their own recoveries in hospitals and homes across the country. Windsor Castle has held celebrations and state mournings and moments of national uncertainty across centuries. What gathered at its gates now was something quieter than any of those. It was confirmation that one family's experience of fear had reached into the private lives of thousands of others who recognized it from their own. A newspaper put Catherine's expression across its front page with 2 lines of text beneath it, a mother's voice, and then, in smaller print, Louis's own phrase about becoming strong again. That front page mattered because of what it chose not to do. It did not frame him as damaged or diminished. It treated recovery as an act of courage and placed a mother's willingness to be honest about that experience above any institutional statement. Some commentators continued to press for answers. They asked why the palace had maintained silence for so long, and why earlier absences had not been explained. Officials responded clearly that a child's health is not public property, and that the family had shared enough to acknowledge the truth of the experience without giving up every private detail that still belonged to them. When one phrase from the recording, a reference to the moment the family had feared recovery, was moving in the wrong direction, generated intense speculation, aides recommended a follow-up clarification before the questions grew louder. Catherine declined. Explaining every frightening detail, she said, would destroy the privacy they had worked so hard to preserve. Some things were not owed to anyone outside the family. The moment that actually mattered most did not happen in any briefing room or in front of any camera. It happened when William found Louis sitting quietly sometime after the announcement had gone out. The protective circle of doctors, siblings, and adults that had surrounded the boy for months was gone. William walked into the family's private garden room and found his son alone with his thoughts. He passed the chair beside him and sat down on the floor instead, bringing himself to the same level as the child. Then he asked one simple question. How did Louis feel now that people knew? Louis thought before answering. He said he had noticed that his father had stopped talking about royal engagements whenever he walked into the room. Before the illness, hearing about an upcoming engagement had felt exciting to him. During his recovery, those conversations just disappeared. He had started to think that everyone around him had decided he would never be well enough to be part of that world again. William had removed every mention of royal duty from their shared conversations in order to protect his son from feeling any pressure. But the effect had been to make the boy feel quietly excluded from his own future. Then Louis told his father something William had not known. During the hardest week, he had heard him crying outside the bedroom door. Louis had kept his eyes closed and stayed still because he did not know what he was supposed to do for someone in that much pain. That is the admission that ended whatever composure the future king had left. William pulled his son toward him and said out loud what he had spent months trying not to admit. Bravery does not mean never being afraid. It means speaking when the fear makes silence feel easier. Louis held on. Then he made a decision of his own. He did not want a grand ceremony as his first return. He wanted a small family gathering where George and Charlotte could stay beside him the whole time. Catherine came in only after that conversation had finished. She looked at William's face and then at Louis and understood without being told that something fundamental had shifted between them. The two parents agreed together that there would be no formal statement, no staged appearance, and no external timeline. Louis would return when Louis was ready. His first reappearance came at a small gathering connected to a children's community project. No publicity had been arranged in advance. There was no formal speech and no expectation that he perform in any way for anyone watching. A community project of this kind exists to support local families and children, and this one gave him the chance to step back into royal life without the weight of a major public ceremony pressing down on him. Louis paused just before going inside. Charlotte reached for one of his hands. George took the other. Catherine did not move him forward or try to cover his hesitation. She waited until her son made the choice himself. Then the three children walked through the door together. William stood back and watched and understood something he had been working toward for months without quite reaching it. Recovery did not mean reassembling the version of Louis that had existed before the illness. It meant building a new sense of what safety felt like. He had once measured privacy by how much the family managed to keep from the world. By the time Louis walked back in through that door, he understood that silence could protect a child's body while leaving something else entirely exposed. Catherine had arrived at the opposite understanding by a different route. Honesty had freed Louis from the shame he had been carrying, but it could not become an excuse to put every medical detail in front of the public. She had chosen to speak through a personal recorded statement rather than a formal release because that format allowed her to be truthful about the experience without surrendering the boundaries Louis still needed around his own story. In a private family conversation afterward, Charles said that the monarchy had not been weakened by the decision to speak. He believed it had come out stronger because the family had faced real difficulty without converting private pain into public spectacle. For an institution that has historically relied on restraint as its primary signal of dignity, that was a meaningful thing to say. This moment demonstrated that dignity and emotional honesty are not in competition with each other. When Louis finished the gathering and came back to his parents, he did not ask whether he would be allowed to attend something like that again. He asked when they could go back. That question was the answer to everything the family had been carrying for months. His recovery continued gradually and steadily, and the family placed his confidence and his childhood ahead of any ceremonial expectation. Catherine was shown a photograph of the blue stars left outside Windsor Castle. She pressed her fingers against one message written by another child and asked quietly that the display be preserved for Louis to see. William read a letter from a father who had been struggling to explain a serious illness to his own children and had found something useful in what the family had chosen to share. He understood, reading it, that their honesty had reached people they would never meet and had done something for them that discretion alone could not have managed. Louis chose one star to keep beside his bed. The message written on it was short. You were brave even when you were resting. The monarchy's response was to remain steady. There would be no campaign around the moment, no celebratory images released to the press, no accelerated return to public life. Catherine's decision had never been a challenge to the institution or an attempt to generate coverage. It was a mother putting right a message that fear had written and giving her son the chance to understand himself as someone who was recovering rather than someone who was hidden. The family had spent months believing that love meant building walls around Louis as high and solid as they could make them. They came out of it understanding that protection sometimes means listening carefully, being willing to say the true thing, and having the courage to admit that you were afraid even when everyone around you needed you not to be. The silence had done what it was supposed to do for as long as it needed to. Then something more important than silence was required. Princess Catherine spoke so that Prince Louis would never again confuse a private struggle with something to be ashamed of. And when Louis walked through that door holding his brother's hand on one side and his sister's on the other, without being carried forward or shielded from his own hesitation, the fear had already lost its grip. The hardest part was behind them. If you want to stay current on royal family stories as they develop, subscribe to Crown Watch so you never miss an update. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.